and welcome everybody. This is our 8th session, and we're going to be looking at the processes for harvesting and cleaning your seed. We'll be looking at a number of areas, and when we started putting this content together, we thought about what's the best way to explain this, and we thought we'd kind of group our harvesting into small dry seeded crops, larger dry seeded crops, and wet seeded crop processing. So hopefully you all become clear. We'll be looking at different methods that we can use, and then looking at the kind of drying and storage requirements so that you can make the most out of your harvest. With me on this session, I've got my colleague Lucy Shepherd. She's our seed officer here, and she's responsible for doing all the processing and drying of the seeds that we use in our cold store at the Heritage Seed Library. So she'll be in the background helping out with any questions that you have. So we will crack on. We're going to cover a whole range of crops, but clearly if you are growing anything specific that we haven't covered, there will be opportunities at the end to have a kind of Q&A session. Anything we can't help you with immediately, we'll go away and find the answers for you and come back with information about how to harvest and clean the seed that you've been growing. So first of all, it's worth reminding ourselves of the general principles that we've been talking about throughout the whole process of webinars so far, that we are trying to maintain a very long growing season in order to make sure we've got the ripest possible seed at the end of it, according to their natural life cycle. So as part of that process, we'll be looking at whether your crops are annual or biennial, and we'll have accounted for that in your growing plans and your growing timings. What kind of vegetable type will determine how long you grow for and when you start sowing, and there'll be differences between your varieties that you might be growing for seed. So I know we've looked at the importance of knowing your crops and knowing what you're actually planning to grow for seed is an important part of that. Generally, our growing season starts quite early in the year because we want to create a long growing process. And if you've got annual crops, usually we can be harvesting our first crops, maybe our peas, from about June onwards all the way through to November. For biennial seed production, obviously that's a completely different time scale that you need to consider, and you'll be growing over 2 seasons. Some things are sown right at the start of the early spring in the first year, such as brassicas, or you might be sowing summer crops like carrots to ensure that you've got a first year growing just at the right time for the temperatures to drop and for you to do your selections for the second year. So how do you know when your harvest plants are ready to harvest for seed production? And of course, the most important thing is to understand that your crops need to reach full maturity. Often that will occur at an edible ripe stage, but more often than not, it's way beyond the normal stage that you would be picking for food produce. So we'll be looking at that for each of the vegetable types that we're going to be looking at this afternoon. We're doing this obviously on a slightly large scale in terms of number of varieties that we grow for seed each year. So we'll be growing around 90 to 100 varieties to seed. Depending on what your plans are and your ambitions to build up your seed production, it's worth just having a kind of visual to see just where those pinch points are in your growing year. In terms of things like leeks, onions, carrots, and brassicas, they're appearing here as their second year. So this is when we're talking about harvesting for seed. And you can see our busiest time of year is pretty much now. Lots of crops are coming through for us to harvest, even though we've had quite a slow start, a cold start to the year. But it's worth bearing in mind your local growing conditions. And of course, we are mostly growing under cover. So we're big users of polytunnels to grow our crops. And this kind of approximate calendar really reflects what we're trying to do. So what is seed cleaning? Well, essentially, you just want to kind of remove the wheat from the chaff, as they say. Essentially, you are trying to get the seed out of its container and leaving anything else behind that you don't want to use. We clean our seeds to a high standard, and we'll be showing you the methods that we do to do that. But for you as a group, particularly as you're an aspiring commercial grower, this is a really important element to your finish to your growing year, because there are purity standards that you would need to meet as a commercial grower. Fortunately, all of the methods that we're going to show you will pretty much meet those standards, so you should be fine. But you just need to bear in mind that once you have registered with AFA, if you're going down the commercial route, you are likely to have your growing sites and your seed stocks inspected and tested for purity. So not only the variety themselves as being true to type as described, but also your seed stocks as well need to be free of excessive amounts of dust and chaff, etc. So aside from the requirements to grow, produce a pure seed, obviously there are very good reasons why you want to have a good clean seed at the end of your harvesting and processing. Obviously there might be pests hiding in the chaff that will damage your seed. It's a great opportunity to inspect your seed, either for evidence of cross-pollination or any other kind of pathogen issues that you might need to consider, and the quality of the seed that you end up using and storing. And also, of course, when you come to sow the seed again, if you've got an awful lot of material in your seed stocks, whether that's small grains of dirt or grit, but you may end up with sort of patchy drills when you re-sow again. So it's really helpful for us to use processes that are going to get your seed as clean as possible. And for us, everything from the largest seed, which is a broad bean, down to the tiny celeriac seed, will have different methods of cleaning that we try and use to reach that standard of pure seed. So you might be already harvesting. Like I say, for us, peas have already come in and we're pretty much done with those now. But you might be thinking about investing in some seed cleaning equipment. Again, it really does depend on the scale at which you're growing. And for us at the Seed Library, all of our growing is done at conservation level. So we're always growing to minimum population sizes, not to grow particularly large seed stocks. And as a result, a lot of our seed cleaning processes are done by hand and on a particularly small scale. So the good news for you, if you're just starting out, pretty much any equipment that you need, you can probably find in your kitchen. Jam jars, sieves, chopping boards, etc. Trays and funnels and scales and things like that are always going to be useful. And having the space to dry and process your seed crops is great. And we'll be talking about some of the equipment that we've brought in as we look at some specific crops and how we use them to clean our seed. But you might also be considering the kind of equipment that you need to scale up that seed saving processes. So some important kit that we have ourselves on site, which is really useful for some of our larger growing seed populations that we use. So we have here in the middle, this is a well-used bit of kit. It's a gravity seed separator, essentially a winnower, which uses the weight of the seed against the weight of the chaff, essentially, to separate out the two. A bit like an obstacle course with a vacuum cleaner attached, essentially. And it's worth noting that websites like the Real Seeds Company has got a good prototype instructions on how to build your own. This is quite an expensive piece of kit, probably, well, it was donated to us, but could easily run into thousands of pounds. And likewise, the larger version that we have on the left-hand side is one of our larger scale winnowers, which is great for processing larger population crops like brassicas, for example, and small seeded crops that require quite a lot of winnowing. Again, this kind of kit can come into the tens of thousands of pounds. So there are alternatives out there, second-hand models. I know Real Seeds, for example, have refurbished a really old version of a seed cleaning machine. It might be that you want to think about whether you invest in those for a larger scale seed production. On the right-hand side, we'll be talking a little bit more about this when we look at seed quality and stock management at our next webinar. But this is an incubator for germination testing. Again, we have this on site. We use it a lot through the year to manage the quality of our seed and also to pre-germinate crops, seed crops that we have a more delicate seed for. But again, it might be something that you'd be interested in investing in. However, under lockdown, when we didn't have access to the incubator, Lucy spent an awful lot of time doing germination tests under a bed. So again, you might want to think about what level of investment you need to make in your processing. Other bits of kit that worth investing in, particularly things like face masks and gloves, if you are processing large quantities of seed, however straightforward a small quantity might be. If you're doing it on a larger scale, making sure that you've got face masks for dusty crops. And we'll talk about those a little further on. We also found investing in some anti-static bands were really useful as well. Processing crops like lettuce seed, they can become highly static. Often you find in dry conditions you get covered in a lot of seed. So basic bits of kit like that are always really useful. I think we are producing a fact sheet toolkit, which will be produced in time for the next webinar, which will list some of these items on there. So we'll be talking about things like sieves and sieve sizes. They will be useful information for you to consider if you're going to invest in seed cleaning equipment. So we're going to move on to some of our crops, and we've got some demonstration of crops that we've got here, but I'm going to start off with the easiest one. I don't think I need to teach you how to do this, but we're looking at large dry seeded crops, and essentially we're talking here about legumes that we harvest on site. The peas being the first to come in, and what's really important is that we ensure that we harvest them as dry as possible. For us, that means leaving them on the plant for as long as possible. So you can see our classic edible stage, Mange 2, for example, particular variety. But we might leave it to a much later stage where you can see that the pods and the plant itself is drying off. There is a balance to be struck. We would want to make sure that we leave them on for as long as possible. But of course, for many podded vegetables, you don't want to get to the stage when you are potentially losing seed because it's been left on there too long. Equally so, you might find that when the weather turns cold, and particularly if you're growing outside, of course, which is the case for many of our legumes on site at the seed library, you don't want to get to a stage where the weather is going to ruin any later harvesting of your seed. With crops like these, you're going to be succession picking if you're doing hand picking. So you might want to bring in plants that are coming to the end of that stage and hang them up to dry for further if the weather is closing in at the end of the year. One of the things that we do to check whether or not the seed is ready is a thumbnail test. Very simple, as you can see, the growing stages for your podded crops are going to be reaching through different stages, and knowing when to harvest those pods, often it's worth doing a spot check where you open one of the pods, press your nail into the seed coat, and if there's some resistance to that, often that's good enough stage at which you can bring them in to dry perhaps a little bit further, but then pod them yourself. It's worth bearing in mind yield. One of the compromises of growing for seed is that with things like French bean plants, for example, if you continuously harvest the immature pods, and by that I'm talking about pods that you would perhaps eat at a green edible stage, then that will affect the overall yield, because if you're not collecting any of those pods at any point, they will reach a point where you've got fewer pods to harvest. We would obviously factor that into our planning in terms of understanding the yield for each of those varieties. And again, similarly, the difference between a dwarf and a climbing French bean will affect your yield significantly. It's worth bearing in mind the broad bean pods will generally turn black when they're ready to pick, so well beyond the edible green stage that you would expect to see. And for legume pods like this is a really good opportunity for you to take a close look at the seed. Usually this is a point at which you're going to filter out those that you don't want to keep. Remember our key principles around seed cleaning, including saving seed from only the very best examples. So this may well be your opportunity to look at these pods, look at the seeds, and remove those that aren't viable. If you're going to be doing this on a large scale, you might consider different seed cleaning methods. We generally hand pod our crops. We have a willing and useful army of volunteers who are able to do this for us. If you're doing this on a much larger scale, harvesting a large field of crops, things like peas, for example, you can thresh them by putting them in a pillowcase or a sack or a duvet cover and treading them down. Seeds generally tend to be pretty resilient, obviously within reason. You can use rolling pins over them. Again, of course, at the end of this, you will need to use a winnowing process, which you might not need to use if you're hand podding. So again, depending on the scale that you're using, growing these crops, there are different methods to hand for you to think about. And other than checking the general quality of seed, it's also an opportunity to look at one of the key pests that we deal with, which is Pea and Bean Weevil. And particularly for us, broad beans always seem to attract bean weevil. And this may not be evident at the stage of podding. So we always assume that they are bean weevils ready to emerge from all of our broad bean crops. And when we do harvest them, we will then put them in a deep freeze for around 7 to 10 days. A key important part of that is to make sure that the seed is already dry enough to withstand the freezing process before that starts. So you can use a thumbnail test on those seed coats. If you think the seeds are not quite dry enough, then what we will often do is we'll dry them further but cover them with some kind of insect resistant mesh. We usually use one of our fine sieves, but you might want to be able to cover them with a very fine mesh. If you do have any kind of outbreak, obviously you don't want to spread that to any other crops that you're harvesting. And again, once you've dried them, freeze them for a week to 10 days. Then you want to make sure that they are dry again when you take them out of the freezer. So usually dry them for a further week before you finished harvesting them. We divided our seed cleaning methods up into large and smaller seed for dry seeded crops, and we're going to look specifically at a group of several groups of small seeded crops and look at the different methods for seed cleaning that we use for them. This group includes seeds that form on umbels, so things like carrots, things that form on seed heads, so onions and leeks. We'll be looking at lettuce seed, which produces these parachute plumes. And we'll be looking at small podded seeds, so brassicas, things like radish and cabbages, for example. And stem seed, so things like beetroot, chard, and amaranth, spinach, and the different seed cleaning methods that we use to cover them. Some are annual, some are biennial, but in basic terms, when you get to the point of seed cleaning, you want to make sure that they have come from flowers that are produced a seed head or a seed pod or some kind of stem seed that's at the driest stage possible. You will be able to see the seeds starting to form quite early on once you've had successful pollination, but you want to be leaving these seed heads to dry for a considerable period of time before you harvest them in order to do that. In all cases with these kind of small seeded crops, we find they're much easier to seed clean at their driest stage. So very often there is an additional period of time of drying where you might bring them into a glass house or a garage or your kitchen for further drying before you actually do the process of seed cleaning. We use large hot bays in our glass houses, and we spread out mesh and things in order to fleece, for example, in order to catch any seeds. But let's look at some of these crops individually in a bit more detail. So umbel formed heads. So we're looking here at carrots, parsnip, celeriac, for example, and they are going to be flower clusters which form on long stalks. And as a general rule, you only really want to be saving the seed from the largest umbels that form. So they're going to be the first umbels that form, and they'll continue to throw out smaller flower heads as they go along. Depending on your growing season, you're going to really want to focus on the larger ones that are going to be drying for seed saving. Generally, seed is ripe when the flower heads turn brown and become brittle, and the seeds will start to come free of their stalks. You may need to harvest repeatedly over several weeks, and you'll get to a point where you'll draw a line and you won't want to harvest any of the smaller umbels at that stage. If you decide you need to harvest all in one go, so if you don't have the resources to manage that, I would suggest just harvest in one go, but then allow a period of extra drying in order to get as much seed from them as possible. Seed cleaning umbels, and we're going to be looking at some carrot heads in a moment. This could be an extremely dusty process. So harvesting a small amount, not an issue particularly, but larger quantities you're going to be wanting to wear a face mask. That's particularly the case with carrot seed, which is quite spiky, and it can be quite irritating to your nose and throat as you're cleaning it. You may want to invest in an extractor fan. We have an extraction box which allows us to do all of this seed cleaning with a hovering extractor fan. That may well be something that you want to invest in for a larger scale seed production. So let's have a quick look at our seed umbels that we have here. I'm just going to share a camera shot just to see what I'm talking about. We're not quite ready. We're not quite at the stage of processing our carrot seed heads at the moment. They're drying nicely on the plants in the polytunnels. So I've gone to our box of seed samples just to show you what we're looking for. As I said before, it's this kind of size umbel, unless you really are desperate to save this seed for any reason, because you've only got you've had a poor harvest. Generally, we would reject these for seed cleaning. We really are interested in these larger umbels. This is not particularly a large umbel, but what we're trying to do, if it will focus, is look for the spiky seed heads that are the carrot seed. So apologies if this is a little bit out of focus. We find the best way to seed clean these, again, is by hand. We've got here a lab sieve, and again, this might be the kind of kit that you would be interested in investing in. You can buy them secondhand online. They can cost anywhere between a few pounds and £100, depending on where you're buying them, but they are useful. We have a number of them, and you can stack them up to help speed up the process of seed cleaning. But for carrot seed heads, basically what you're trying to do is remove those tiny spikes that have appeared on the seed heads and end up with a clean seed at the end of it. So we find the abrasive surface of a sieve is generally good enough. We talked about the clean seed standards. This is part of that process. So what you really want to be ending up with is a nice smooth carrot seed head at the end of it. Obviously doing that on a large scale, we have different processes to do that, but essentially we are doing that all by hand. The second group that we're going to be looking at are allium seed heads. So we're talking here our leeks and our onions, essentially. Again, at this time of year, we are still growing these seed heads. We've had quite a successful year so far as we can tell, but we won't know until we actually take those seed heads in and seed clean them to see whether our pollination efforts have been effective. For pollinating, we've introduced pollinators. So you may recall on previous webinars, we talked about using anglers' fishing maggots, pupating into flies, and we've used them for all of our alliums and our carrots seed heads this year. So we're hopeful that they've been extremely effective in producing seed. They can be a little bit more tricky to get the seed out of them, and we will often, you can often use quite firm methods to get the seed out. So you can crush them with sieves. We often roll them with rolling pins or glass jars in order to get the seed out. We actually do have a device where we tumble them with weights in order to try and remove the seed head from them, for the seed from the seed head. and that tends to be quite effective. But if you are hand seed cleaning them, again, this is quite a straightforward thing to do. So I'm going to switch camera and show you our allium head. So as I said, we're still drying ours out. So this is quite an older seed head, nice and dry. We found with previous years where we've done hand pollinating, we found that that's less effective in order to produce the seed in allium heads with using brushes. But this is the time when you find out when you're doing your seed cleaning. And what you're looking to find, and again, we would normally use abrasive sieves, series of sieves in order to work through these, is you're looking for these tiny black irregular angular shaped seeds within them. We find using abrasive sieve will actually break the seed heads off a little bit, but you'll need to use winnowing or a series of different size sieves in order to make this work. In the case of alliums, we also do a float test to remove any of the remaining debris off the seed, but also remove any seed that's not viable. So we use a transparent container. You can see what you're doing. We would soak the seeds for around 30 minutes in that water, and any viable seed will sink to the bottom, leaving chaff and any non-viable seed floating on the surface where we can skim it off. After you've done that, obviously it's very important to then re-dry your seed again. So you want to make sure it's fully dried out before you then put it into any kind of storage.
Katrina, there's a question in the chat just asking,
Sure.
Could you repeat the name of the sieves that you're using?
Yes, so these are lab test sieves, or laboratory test sieves. They're lab standard calibrated sieves. We acquired a whole load of them secondhand from a university, but you can buy them if you put in a search engine, labs test sieves. You'll see there's a whole range of them. And I think in the workshop notes, the toolkit notes that we will be sending out before the next webinar, I think we've got a bit of guidance on mesh sizes and the best way to use them for different harvesting types. But they are worth investing in. We stack them so that we can actually have multiple sieving, so we can sieve out large debris at the top, seed in the middle, and dust at the bottom, and it just helps speed up the process. You can use soil sieves. We use those for some things as well. So if you've got a large soil sieve and you want to sieve out things like pods and debris, often that's quite useful to be able to use those as well. Okay. So another group, small seed pods. Well, we're talking essentially here those of the Brassica family. So they will form these cilique pods, these long pods, or in the case of a radish, slightly chunkier pods. And essentially we are going to be growing them to a really dry stage. Again, it's that balance that needs to be struck between sowing seed and allowing it to dry and harvest, dry and mature on the plant before you harvest, and the risk of pods splitting. You will find that as with all of these crops, there's a kind of gradient, and you might find that you're multiple harvesting. There'll be some pods that aren't ready, others that are ready to harvest. And again, you're going to have to figure out that balance involved in harvesting. We collect every few days, or you could leave it for as long as possible, remove the entire stalks, take them indoors, hang them upside down, possibly within a large paper sack, something like that, and allow them to dry further. It depends really that you balance that risk between seed pod splitting and reseeding the following year, and losing some of that seed crop yourself. In terms of seed cleaning, we tend to find, because with brassicas you're going to be growing a much larger population size. So although we classify them as one of the trickier crops, you may recall from previous webinars when we talked about growing brassicas, whether they're annual radishes or biennial cabbages, that there is a large population size required generally to rogue out any atypical plants and also manage any losses along the way, and also to ensure that you've got a suitable gene pool. So we're going to be cleaning these on a much larger scale because you're likely to have a much larger harvest. Very simple, as you can see from the pictures. Generally, there's a process of drying further after you've harvested most of your seed pods. You might want to lay them out somewhere dry on some kind of surface of fleece or paper so that you don't lose any seeds as they further dry. And again, they are pretty robust, so you can trample them. We've used large sacks before. Fortunately, we have a winnower. That large winnower that I showed you earlier is something that we use in order to manage that process. You know, if you are going to do that, obviously you're going to need to winnow them out as well. One of the other things that you can do with particularly brassica seeds like cabbage is that they're very round. So we have used a surface method where you have a nice smooth surface, a tray for example, and you can tilt the crushed debris and allow the round seeds to roll down to the bottom of the tray. Different methods of doing it. Again, it depends on the scale that you're doing this. It's not going to work for things like radish seed necessarily because they're not particularly round. But we find that the final clean in this way on an inclined tray can help remove that last bit of dust and debris that you might have on your seed. And finally, on the looking at the stems, we're going to be looking at the dry seeded stem crops before we move on to lettuce seed. These are covered by spinach and chard and beetroot and amaranth. We would classify our seed cleaning method along the same way. Generally, seed clusters are going to develop along the stem or some kind of inflorescence, and they can be quite difficult to remove. They're ripe when they start to dry out and they turn brown. Excuse me. So this is a classic sort of beetroot stem at the early stages of seed production, not yet dry enough, but you want to get them to a stage when they're really nice and brown and ready to harvest for seed cleaning. And it's worth looking at the harvest that we've brought in just this week. So we're just starting with our beetroot seed cleaning. Again, there'll be succession visits to collect the material, and we'll be harvesting over several weeks to look at them. Often hanging up your spinach or your stem plants for a little bit of time somewhere where they can dry further is going to be helpful. And this is where our homemade seed cleaning comber comes in. It's a useful way to clean large quantities of stem crops. We've got some amaranth in here. This is something that we put together at the seed library. We don't have any plans for it as such, but essentially it's two sets of combing surfaces on a drawer, sliding drawer fitting, which helps comb through the strands of seed and take some of the donkey work out of combing them. Otherwise, we would hand comb the seeds off the stems themselves. So let's have a look at the harvest that we brought in this week. And we've got this drying in our glass house at the moment. Really, the point of showing you this is just to illustrate the graduation of seed size that occurs with things like beetroot. And we've got these large, really chunky clusters at one end, and they'll go to the fine clusters at the other. Now, we were able to winnow out these small amounts. We wouldn't necessarily want to keep these small seed heads. You may need to use sieves to do this, but it's worth bearing in mind that these are seed clusters, so they're easily crushed down into smaller sizes. So you want to be as careful as you possibly can with these. They're pretty robust. You can generally just comb the seeds off themselves. We usually put gloves on to do this because if you're doing it on a small scale, it doesn't really matter. But on a larger scale, these are actually quite rough seeds to do. And it's a healthy sized seed cluster that you want to end up with that you can then use for your stock purposes. So finally, in our dry seed plots, we're going to be looking at lettuce seed. We have just finished harvesting our lettuce. It is the longest, the earliest sown crop in our collection that we grow. We want a nice long growing season, but a very controlled growing season through the right temperatures in the year. So if you may recall from previous webinars, we will manage that flowering and seed production process over several months. Our last seed heads came in this week, and I've got one of them here to show you what those plumes look like as they form. So we've gone through the stage of the yellow flowers. We succession harvest our lettuce. So there's a couple of ways of doing this. And again, it depends on the seed yield and its significance to you in your growing year. So we will have grown from about 10 plants. Lettuce is prolific. It will produce huge quantities of seed. We try and save as much seed as we possibly can by succession harvesting. And the reason for that is that lettuce seed has got pretty good shelf life. So even though we will produce tens of thousands of seed, hundreds, if not thousands of packets worth of seed for our members and for our library use, we want to make sure that we keep as much of that seed as possible. You, on the other hand, you may decide that you just want to do a single harvest, in which case what we would do is recommend that you leave as many of your seed heads to get to the dry stage like this as possible. You will start shedding seed, those plants will start shedding seed, so there will be a balance to be struck as to losing seed and allowing you to do this in one single go. Again, you could do the same thing as you would do with brassicas. You could cut those entire seed heads down when you've got to a particular stage, hang them upside in a large paper bag and allow the seed to dry further. One thing to bear in mind with lettuce seed is if you do succession pick like we do, it's a little bit harder because the plumes themselves have got a kind of sticky resin to them that can make it quite a messy job. If you do seed clean them when they're extremely dry, it's also a very dusty job. So you would want to make sure that you've got face masks on. But again, it's a really simple process. We use an abrasive surface. We actually use stacked sieves. So although I've just got one sieve here, we might have a coarser sieve on top, which will allow us to break away all the plume heads themselves and will allow the dust to drop to the bottom and any of the smaller unusable seed to do that. But again, what you want to end up with is a nice plume-free seed that is going to be viable for you to use and a healthy size. So you may want to use winnowing to do that. We find lettuce seed is one of the harder things to winnow because the debris that you don't want to keep is a very similar weight to the seed that you do want to keep. So there's a little bit of toing and froing to make sure that you've got the seed completely clean from your for the chaff and the plumes, etc., and dust that you don't want in that seed. But at the end of it, you will be rewarded with a large amount of seed. We tend to use a 1 millimeter sieve to separate the plumes and chaff from the seed, but you might find that you need to go through that a couple of times just to remove most of the debris from the final seed. So our final group, I'll work through this quite quickly, is our wet seeded crops. So for some of our wet seeded crops, you're going to be harvesting the fruit at the same time that they're edible. So for tomatoes, that's quite simple. You're going to be harvesting them when they're at their reddest or their orangest or their yellowest, whatever the the characteristic is for that fruit. For peppers, as a general rule, you want to be harvesting them at their reddest stage or their purplest stage, regardless of which stage you would normally harvest them to eat, whether that's green or orange or yellow, etc. And for some fruits, you want to leave them on the plant longer, beyond the edible stage. In particular, things like cucumbers, you want to grow them on way beyond the kind of edible green stage. You want them to be looking closer to kind of inedible yellow stage before you grow them. Similarly with aubergines, we leave them on the plant for as long as possible, usually until they start going quite saggy, and then there'll be a period of additional drying off the plant before you actually harvest the seed from the ripe fruit itself. For tomatoes, we use a fermentation process. Each year we process probably 3,000 to 4,000 tomatoes this way. We do this by hand and simply by cutting the fruit open, removing the seed, adding some water to a jar and fermenting for 3 to 5 days in order to remove that gelatinous coating from the seed. What you'll end up with is a hard seed. You will feel that the gelatinous coating has been removed, and then you can dry that seed out further in order to store it. One point to think about is if you're using a fermentation method, you can do it on a much bigger scale. We do it jam jar by jam jar. We might be processing 20 or 30 different varieties, so it's very important for us to be able to separate out and understand what we're growing. If you're doing it on a larger scale, we're talking buckets scale here, it's exactly the same process. Harvest all of your seed, cover it with a good quantity of water, mix daily, stir daily, sorry, and then at the end of 3 to 5 days, generally you'll have clean seed that you can then lay out and dry for storage. One thing to bear in mind is if you leave the seed in too long, there is always a risk that the seed will start germinating. So we have found there's been quite a difference depending on the temperature, the ambient temperature. If it's hotter weather, you might find that process can happen more quickly. So inspect every day. You are going to have to remove those seeds that have already started germinating because they won't be viable. So it's worth keeping an eye on them before they get to that stage so that you can actually make sure the seed is clean. Again, always a balance, but worth bearing in mind if you're processing these seeds. Other wet-seeded crops that we manage are generally our cucurbits, so things like squashes, cucumbers, melon, things like that. With squashes and other fruits, we will bring them inside to dry further. So for squashes, we usually bring them in and leave them for at least a couple of weeks. You'll often find the outside of the squash is quite hard, and we often need to saw them open in order to access the seed inside. Usually washing them under a sieve with some abrasion to get off all the fleshy coating is usually good enough. You might want to do that process again after you've dried them to make sure that they're completely clean. For something like a cucumber, you can use a fermentation method. Again, they may have a gelatinous coating that's quite difficult to clean off with abrasion. So you could use a fermentation method for that. And for things like melon seeds and squash seeds, after you have seed cleaned them, very often you'll get this kind of translucent coating, this dry coating. Again, after they've dried, you want to run them through your hands or sort of roll them through some kind of abrasive process to remove that coating on that seed as well. You can do float tests for cucurbits. We occasionally do them for cucumbers in the same way as you might do for a leek, with the general principle being good seed sinks and poor seed floats. But a much quicker way is to spot check using to break open seed. We winnow out the much lighter, smaller seed anyway, so the winnowing process is quite important for us. But you can generally tell if a seed is flat and hollow, and if you break that seed open, you'll be able to see that as well. Obviously, that's important that you're only saving the best examples and those seeds that are going to be viable. So having the large, heavier seed filtered out from the lighter seed is an important way to proceed.
Katrina, can I just add there that one of the problems we had last year was them germinating. And what I found was you could see the ones that were going to germinate because the hole had just opened very slightly. And you could see, so you could kind of easily see which ones were not going to be viable because that hole in the end had opened ready for germination.
Right, so a split
Yeah.
at one end of the seed coat would be something that you'd want to inspect for. That's really useful. Thank you, Lucy. It's worth bearing in mind something like a melon, for example. If you allow a melon to over ripen, you'll get 5 to 10% more seed in that melon. But if you've gone to all of the trouble to grow a melon, and they're quite hard to grow for seed, to be perfectly honest, we don't have a very high yield. We might only actually produce 1 or 2 fruits per plant that we want to save for seed. You might not want to leave them to go beyond that stage. You actually might want to enjoy them as a fruit because there's so much effort put into growing them. So again, depending on your purposes, depending on the scale that you're growing, how many fruit and how much yield you need for your own seed production purposes, all of these crops are going to have different thresholds where you decide when you're going to harvest the seed and in order to get the most out of it. A quick point on extended ripening before I touch on the drying process. As Lucy's pointed out, there's a risk of germination happening with some of these crops. So on the left here, you've got some cucumbers. They will have been left on the plants for as long as possible. But again, weather factors and ripening time factors will have been taken into account, and they will have been brought in to ripen off further. For things like cucumbers, you can rot them down as a method of seed production. It's quite disgusting, so you might decide not to do that in terms of smell and mess. But again, you want to make sure that you balance that with spot checking harvests that you're doing that to make sure that there isn't any germination or even rotting going on in your crops. The middle plant there, the middle fruit there, that's an aubergine. So whether your standard aubergine, whether it's white or purple or whatever, actually the ripest point, natural life cycle stage for aubergine in terms of seed production is going to be when they've kind of turned brown. They lose that shine, they're a shiny fruit, and often they will start to dry out. Again, there's a balance to be struck with rot starting to rot, and also with actually producing seed. It's quite hard. We find aubergines particularly difficult to grow for seed here at Brighton. They've got a long growing season, and we grow them in our polytunnels generally. So we have to strike that balance between rot and harvest and ripeness in order to do that. And as you can see on the right hand side, sometimes you don't discover that there's an issue until you get to the point where you've got seed clean them. So this is either a squash or a doody that we've opened, and clearly you can see that the seed inside it has already started to germinate. Generally that's bad news completely for the whole crop, so you have to kind of factor that in as well. Now, I am conscious of time, so I'm going to quickly touch on the drying and storing methods. We'll be looking at some of this in more detail in our next webinar anyway, so no problem. We'll be looking at methods that are going to keep your seed viable and good quality for as long as possible. But it's worth pointing out the general rule here for seed production. This is all orthodox seed, which means that it will respond well to drying and cooling as a means of extending its lifespan. So all of the crops we consider, that is the effect of cleaning and drying seed when it's at its most ripe. And those two factors that will reduce the shelf life of the seed are going to be moisture and warmth. So as a general rule, the storage life of seed is doubled for every 5% drop in temperature and every 1% drop in moisture level. The storage, temperature storage is less important than the drying process that you need to dry your seed. So it's very important. When you are growing crops for seed, you are going to be following all of these processes. Ideally, you're going to be leaving them to ripen for as long as possible in their standard growing, whether you're growing it under cover or not. But you are going to have to make that call and bring your plants in maybe to dry further before you pod or sieve or however you're going to remove the seed. What's important then is that you continue to keep those plants dry. And for us, we have an additional drying process to do that. When you harvest your seeds, they're going to be anywhere between 15 and 20% moisture levels potentially. Ideally, what you want to do is get them under 10%, 5% if you're going to freeze them, or under 5% if you're going to freeze the seed, and you'll need a drying process to do that. If you're doing this on a small scale, having on a shelf, a tray or two of seed that you're doing this with, that's not going to be such an issue. If you're going to be doing it on a larger scale, again, you might want to think about how you invest in your drying spaces. We're fortunate enough, we've got a seed drying room. We have moisture controlled equipment there that will bring the moisture levels down to around 15% relative humidity. That brings the seed coat, the seed moisture content down to under 10% generally, which will allow us then to put that seed in the cold store for long-term storage. But you might want to invest in some desiccants. Again, if you're doing this on a very small scale, things like using rice as a desiccant might be one option. You can use just standard shop-bought rice, dry it out on a baking tray for at least an hour at 100 degrees, then use a sealed jar of some kind and place your seeds in an envelope or a cloth bag and completely submerge it in the rice for, as a general rule of thumb, 1 week for small seed, that's up to the cucumber size, and 2 weeks for larger seed, which will generally take you all the way up to something like a broad bean or a large runner bean seed. You can do exactly the same with charcoal, although it's a bit messier. So frankly, if you're going to go down that route, why not use rice? Obviously, you have to make sure that the charcoal is not impregnated with any kind of lighter materials. If you're using barbecue charcoal, you want charcoal that's completely clean, crushed, dried in the same way, and stored in jars with your seed to do that. Again, we're only talking very small quantities of seed to be able to do that with, but it will help make sure that your seed is further dried out and ensure the longevity of the seed that you're saving. Or you could go down the silica gel route. It's much more costly. If you're going to do that, you obviously have to make sure you handle it correctly, so that you're using, you're doing this safely. And it might be a route that you consider. As a general rule, though, we're talking about having somewhere cool and dry to dry your seeds, and anywhere between 1 and 2 weeks of additional drying once you've podded or sieved out your seed is generally going to be good enough before you store them. Storage options: if you're going to sow your seed next year for yourself, then something as simple as keeping it dry and cool in a paper envelope will be fine. But if you're producing seed on a larger scale and you're going to be storing it for any length of time, you might want to consider investing in appropriate storage methods to do that. Either sealed jars. If you're doing it on a much larger scale, we're talking keeping sacks of seed nice and dry and cool somewhere. Or if you're doing it on a smaller scale, you might want to consider foil sealed envelopes, which is what we use at the seed library to manage our seed samples. Again, this is very much dependent on why you're saving the seed and the scale and quantity that you're saving your seed for. Our next session, we're going to be looking at what happens next, essentially. How do you manage your seed stocks? How do you keep them viable? How do you manage the quality control of them? And how you process them to use them for future growing or distribution. So we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. But at this point, I'm going to pause for breath and ask whether there are either any questions in the chat box or whether any questions from participants that we haven't covered that you'd like me to talk about.
Yes, I've got a brief question. I was thinking about planting some seedlings of red iceberg lettuce in the tunnel now, and hopefully harvested some seed in April or May. Would that be possible, or would those long periods of low temperatures really affect the quality of the seed?
No, that's a good question. In fact, I put an item together in the last week or so looking specifically at overwintering lettuces. So yes, you could do that. So the general rule is you want a very long, a long, slow growing season. If you've got an overwintering lettuce variety, then having those lettuces growing so that you can overwinter them under cover if necessary, and then allow them then to produce those seed stalks and produce those seed. That's a perfectly viable way of producing seed. I would certainly recommend giving it a go. We would probably recommend sowing those overwinter lettuces maybe a little bit later in the year. But if you've already got them growing now, why not? They're great because you don't need a large population. I would recommend maybe I identify 10 plants. You are going to lose some along the way. And for things like closed-headed lettuces, one thing to bear in mind is you might need to give them a bit of a helping hand for that seed stalk, that flower stalk rather, to emerge. So with tight-headed lettuces, we would recommend that you actually cut open across on the top of the lettuce head. You may already have done that before, but sometimes that gives us a helping hand. And as that seed stalk, as that flower stalk emerges, you want to be thinking about removing those lower leaves, preventing botrytis and any other issues. That they can be pretty susceptible to that, particularly over, if they've been exposed to the weather for a long period of time or overwintering. So that it might be a little bit tricky. You might need to inspect them a bit more frequently, but definitely you can overwinter a winter lettuce variety in order to produce seed the following year. Might take a little bit later than April, May. You might find it's a bit further along, but as long as they're all kind of progressing at the same rate, then that's generally a good indication that that's working well. So good luck with that.
Oh, thanks very much. I've already grown it, and I was just doing it as an experiment. So
yeah, why not?
That I can re-sow again in March and probably get a crop out of it. I just wanted to see if I could do it over winter. Yeah,
well, give it a go. If you may find the seed's not ready that early in the year, even though you've had a head start, because the plant itself is going to just do its thing at the rate it wants to do. You don't want it to bolt, even though you have already given it a long growing season. Right. But it's definitely worth a go. So yeah, good luck with that.
Cheers.
So Alice Sidwell has raised their hand.
Hi, Alice.
Hiya. Hi. Two questions. I think one you've maybe answered. This is in relation to peas. So we left ours in the ground for quite a long time, and the last ones are a lot shorter on the plant, as they're kind of running out of energy. Will they be less good seed, like with the chards and things, or is the genetic material the same? It's just that there's less in a pod.
Well, we generally, if they're the seed that you've got and you want to use it, that's fine. I think we would still always go back to that general rule, which is save the seed from the best examples of that. So if that pea variety, generally on average, and we would know that about our varieties, produces 5-6 peas a pod, we would want to save peas from pods that produce that. Like I thought, that's what I did.
I was just trying to get the logic of like the genetic thing of it, but and you're quite right, actually. To be honest, once we've harvested our peas, we probably don't worry too much about whether it's a short pod or a long pod. But if you're selecting just a few pods off a plant, we would say just always go for the best examples. But why not? What's important is that the seed is a good size within that pod, and that pod is fairly typical of that plant, so it's the right colour and ideally the right length. But there's no, if it's a good healthy seed inside it, you may decide you want to save that seed as well. Okay. Yeah, and kind of related. So, but also a general question about like little bits of mold or markings of mold. So a few of the peas, like the blacker, there's like black mold starting to come
Yeah.
some of the outside. So
Yeah.
I got rid of those ones, but maybe it depends what the type of mold is.
Yeah, you're right, and we have the same issue here. So we grow most of our peas. We grow under cover in our polytunnels. That's largely to reduce the risk of pea moth, which we can experience. But because of that, the moisture levels in the polytunnels might be quite high. So when we get to the harvest level, you're quite right. We have exactly the same thing. We might have some nice, clean, crisp, pale pea pods that, you know, easy to open, and then we might have some which have got some black speckling of mold on them. Generally, as long as the seed is inside is good and looks good, healthy seed, we don't worry too much about that. If you're in a position where you can choose between the two, then obviously we'd always recommend that you go for the best pods. But if you're doing this on a large scale, generally, as long as the seed itself isn't affected by it, we could tolerate a little bit of that. But it comes down to that. When do you harvest? How long do you leave it on the pod for? Eventually, you're going to have that. But as soon as we do start seeing that happening, that's when we definitely want to make sure that we have harvested what we need as quickly as possible.
Yeah, great. And while I've got you, one more question. I haven't been thinking about it at all during the course, but I've realised that coriander is something that we're going to have that's going to go to seed quite regularly in the garden. And I'm just wondering if you know the kind of if it's an inbreeder and if it will say true to type, or if there are anything to think about with saving coriander seed.
No, I have done some coriander seed saving, experimental, I have to say, in my own garden. So what I don't know, what we can try and find out, is what isolation distances are required. But again, I would think, unless, are you growing lots of different?
No, only one variety. So I'm kind of thinking should be fine.
I would think probably going to be fine, but I will find out for you. I don't know the answer, so I'm not going to bluff you off with an answer. I will find out, but I don't think I would expect a massive isolation distance. I just want to check what other cross-pollination risks might be associated with that. But we'll get back to you. We'll send an email to the Tyfu Cymru programme and make sure that's shared with you around coriander seed.
Thank you. And just with that, like I know you said at the beginning, in general, you want the longest season, the most mature seed. But obviously there's a bit of a mixture with the coriander, like some of them are more mature than others, because they're quite the umbels are all quite close to each other. And we're just taking them out when we need to replant a bed. So it's kind of I'm just wondering how, at what stage you think, oh, that's definitely too green and immature.
Yeah, no, and I suppose as a general rule of thumb, you know, just like your radish pods or any other kind of seed head, you want them nice and dry and pale, really. Okay. So I would say, you know, again, there's a balance to be struck, and without me saying something, without checking first for coriander specifically, as a general rule, you want to be saving the seed from those really dry, those dry seed pods. So I would not, if you don't need to, you know, you might find if there's some staggered ripeness that you might want to allow them to dry a bit further. You might want to pick them and dry them a little bit further. But again, a general rule would be just you want to save the seed from those crispy, dry seed heads. Anything that you have to dry further is going to be at risk of sort of rotting away and not ripening anyway.
Yeah, because some of the ones I've got a little white mold on again, and I think they were just a bit too green probably, so they're not ready. So, and again, trial and error. Thank you, that's great.
No, that's all right. Good luck with that, and I'll try and find a bit more information. We'll send something across for coriander seed. Thanks, Alice. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box from Selena, which is, can you use a home electric dehydrator to dry your seed at a low setting? And Selena's dehydrator, the lowest setting is 35 degrees.
Right, so I would say not to use heat at all for drying. Certainly anything above 25, 30 degrees, generally is not a great idea. We have had seed guardians. So seed guardians are kind of volunteer growers for the seed library who've grown things before, saying that they've dried seed in their oven, and it's like, no, please don't do that. So as a general rule, you want to dry them without heat if that's at all possible. And certainly, I think that certainly 35 degrees would be too hot for that process. Some might survive, and it might, depending on the crop, it might not be too much of an issue. But certainly for things like lettuce seed, they don't like being dried under any kind of heat. Certainly those kinds of temperatures, unfortunately, not great for seed drying. Even having them drying off in an airing cupboard or anything like that, generally we wouldn't recommend. We would say keep them out of direct heat, direct sunlight, and dry them somewhere where they can have a cool breeze to help that drying process. But thank you for the question. Okay. If there are no other questions, although I'm happy to stay around for any more, just to follow up, the Tyfu Cymru website will have obviously this particular webinar, and there are lots of resources on there. The seed saving guidelines that I've been talking about have come from our own website, which you're welcome to access. You can access the growing advice and the seed saving guidelines for free. And as I said, obviously a lot of resources are building up on the Tyfu Cymru website. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at managing your seed stocks in a bit more detail in our next webinar in September, particularly looking at how to keep your seeds viable, but also the kind of record keeping that we would recommend for your stock records, and all of those processes that are associated with that, which will help you manage your seed production. So thank you very much. Are there any more questions?
There's no more questions in the chat.
Thanks, Katie. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Thanks, Lucy, for helping along, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that, Katrina. A great session there. Thank you as well to Katie, who chipped in with a bit of facilitating, and I know Lucy helped out there as well. So thank you to you both as well. And yeah, as Katrina said, the next session's there on the 16th, and I'm sure Sarah D will be sending out invites to that in due course to all of you. So we look forward to seeing you again then.
Right. Thank you very much. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.